All right, everybody. So I know the title says 3D printing, but this is actually a seminar on 3D print finishing. So there's a significant stigma in, at least in the Golden Plains that I've dealt with regarding 3D printed pieces. Sorry. A lot of people think that what you do is you put the or you set the item up on the printer and everything prints, and then you walk away and you don't have to worry about anything else. Once it's done, it's done. You glue it together and you set it on a shelf and, oh, look, pretty. That's not the case. So actually, there's about, for me, even on my smallest piece, there's about 40 hours of post-processing work. I tell people when they're getting into 3D printing that the easiest way to gauge how long it's going to take to finish a project is figure out how long it's going to take for the printer to do the work, multiply that times 5, and then divide it by 1.3. It's silly math, but it works for me. I'm trying to find the piece that I was actually working on. But I don't know where it is. So I will use my backup piece. Okay, so what I'm about to show you guys is what I call, it's going to be the rod of office for Skywatch. I am currently the monarch or the count, or I don't know what the title is. I never paid attention before, of Skywatch, and this is the item once parks reopen again, if I'm still in office, that I will be carrying. Okay, so it is 3D printed, and you can't really see it on the camera, mainly because I'm a terrible cameraman. But there are layer lines. You might be able to see them. I'm not entirely sure. So the way a 3D printer works is it basically goes around the perimeter walls as it goes up, and it builds the thing in layers. It's kind of like those paper puzzles where it's layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and then after about 7 hours of frustration, you have a skull. When you pull it off of the printer, you're going to have your layer. It's going to be done, but you're going to have layer lines. Now, your level of finish work. Oh, there it is. This is the piece I was looking for. This one, you can actually see the layer lines. So if you look by my thumb. Sorry. That's actually more pronounced because there was what's called a shift in the belts that move the print head left to right. That's a sword handle, so it took about 5 hours to print, and probably going to take me about 20 hours to fix all of that and get it nice and smooth so I can mold it, cast it, and do whatever. I'm sorry, I've got 5 things going on in my chat with the monarchy for my park. So when you start, you're going to need you need one thing, but to make your life easier, I would recommend 2. You're going to need sandpaper. I recommend starting at around 80 grit. 60 is good. Any less than that, and you're literally taking off way too much. It's too aggressive. And one of these nifty things. Now, this is called a sanding sponge. Reason I use a sanding sponge is because I've known to put way too much pressure on like a part of a piece that I'm sanding and sand through it. With a sanding sponge, it basically levels out the pressure, so it's across an area as opposed to across like one small section. So what you're gonna do, see if I can set this up so it's easier to see. Move that out of the way. Oh, that should work. All right, so what you're gonna do Is this okay? So this is actually 120 grit sandpaper. And what I'm going to do, since this one is actually quite hollow and fragile, I'm going to do the finishing work on the rod of office. So basically, what you're going to do is you're going to take the sanding, and the layer lines go. So when you print something, your layer lines are going to go in the direction always from left to right. No matter what orientation you put the piece on the machine, it's always going to be left to right, up and down. So when you take it off, the best way to sand it is across the layer lines. If you go along the layer lines, you're basically just polishing your piece. But if you go across, so if you go along the layer lines, which is what I'm doing right now, I don't know if you can see it right there. It hits just those little, like the super high spots, and doesn't really do anything. But if you go across the layer lines, in just that small amount, I've already smoothed out all of these, knocked down the high points on the super high areas, and then the lower parts, obviously I'm gonna have to put more pressure. That's one method of finishing. That's actually the harder method, is sanding everything from print to perfection. What I normally do is I start at 80 grit and I go 80, 120, 220, 320, 400, 600, 800, 1000, 1200, 1500, 2000, 5000, or 2000, 2500. And then if I can find it, I go to 13 or 3200. But if I can't, then I skip straight to 4000. I like to get things almost as smooth as glass, because I want to nearly perfect painted surface when I'm done. If you're not painting, or say if you're using leather wrap for a handle, or if you're covering that in, say, cloth or something else, then sanding really isn't an issue. It's more so based on what you prefer. Another method is what's called resin coating. So what you do is you can either buy 3D printing resin, which is UV cured, or you can buy craft resin. 3D printed resin is faster. A lot of people prefer to use that than anything else. Craft resin is slower, but in my opinion, it is more concise, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Because craft resin, due to the fact that it takes so long to actually set up and cure, it has more time to actually get into the areas between the layer lines and move along to the lower spots and fill those in. So when you do actually get to sanding, you have a lot less work, and it also doesn't blob up or get gloppy, is a term that we use in my shop often. Once you are finished with the sanding, then you're going to go to priming. Now, priming is also something that, there are multiple ways to do. Some people use sandable primer. If you've done all the sanding and you've got it to where you want it and you just want to go straight to paint, sandable primer is great. You're going to spray on a coat, give it a light dusting, sanding, and then maybe 2-3 coats tops. I actually use filler primer first. Now, what filler primer does is it does the same thing that craft resin does. It gets down into the lower spots and fills those in. It has what is called a build volume, and that is the size of the particles that come out of the spray nozzle and how they, you know, when they build together and they build up on that layer. If you're doing filler primer, then you're going to have to do a lot of sanding after the fact, which is why, like I said, it normally takes me quite a long time. This piece here, which is, I'm actually just at the sandable primer stage. This piece, so far, I've put in 60 hours of sanding. This just sanding. It took about, I want to say, 22 hours to print. So I've already tripled that in finishing work, and I'm not even ready for the first layer of paint. And like I said earlier, the reason why I'm doing this is to remove this stigma that people have in their minds that 3D printing is less work intensive than other forms of crafting for ANS. I don't really know how to put it in words. So what I'm going to do is, if you guys have any questions about anything that I'm saying, feel free to ask them when you have them, because I do tend to ramble, and I've got like 900 things going on right now and trying to put out 3 small fires. One of them is an actual fire. So if there's any questions, because I'm kind of stuck right now, so that might help me out to get me moving on a, you know, a regular, a better track.
What type of plastic do you prefer to use when creating your pieces?
Okay, so there's 2 types of plastic, or actually there's like 9 types of plastic. There's PLA, ABS, PETG, HIPS, and 4 other ones that I'm not gonna, or carbon fiber, and a few others that are like super sensitive, like nylon infused and wood filler and all that. I don't use those. I use PLA. It's easy to work with. It's actually the easiest one to work with. It's super fast. It's the lowest temperature and the easiest to maintain. Um, I'll show you, because I actually have a piece printing right now. So this reverse camera is really weird. I have to remember where my which color. Okay, so I don't. Okay, that's a better view. So what you're looking at here, that is actually what is called a failed support. It happens often. It's not anything to worry about. It just means you're going to have more finishing work to do unless you stop the piece and restart it. That piece is about 17 hours in on a 30-hour print. I'm not restarting it. But like I said, I use PLA because it's easy. You put the spool on you put the spool on the spindle, you thread it through your extruder feeder, and then it comes out the hot end layer by layer, and your heated bed is able to maintain all the temperature you need for the piece, for the gradual heat to keep the pieces, the layers from separating due to cold temperatures. ABS is the second choice, but it's easier to sand because it's a more durable plastic. It is also more heat resistant. So for PLA, for example, if you leave PLA, this is Texas, you leave PLA in your car over the summer, or over a hot day in the summer in Texas, you're gonna need a new one. whatever it is, you're going to need a new one, especially if something falls on it. It's going to break, or not break. It's going to melt. ABS has a lot higher heat resistance, so it's less likely to melt or deform on the chance that you leave it in your car or in like heated environment for an extended period of time. Now, I wouldn't recommend it at all, but sometimes things happen. I've been there. Then there's PETG, which is short for something that I don't remember the actual words for. Yeah. So PETG is actually a flexible plastic. It is almost like it's almost like a rubber. It feels when you're done and you're holding the piece. I had a roll of PETG and I printed something out in it, and I cannot find the piece that I printed to show, which is, again, pro tip, organize your workshop. Very important. Actually, okay, so going back to what I was talking about finishing, because I did find the actual piece I was looking for. So the inside of this piece, as you can see, that's what the layer lines look like fresh off the printer. This is what it looks like after hours and hours and hours of sanding. It's kind of dirty and dusty. It's been sitting underneath some stuff. But there we go. And if you look, there's virtually no layer lines. This piece took me, I would say, about 30 hours of sanding to actually get it smooth enough before initial coats of paint, and then sanding in between layers of paint, probably another 15, 16 hours. So about 45 hours of just sanding and painting and sanding and painting and sanding and painting and sanding, painting over and over again ad nauseum. Trust me. At one point, I was so upset with the amount of sanding that I wanted to fight God. I don't. Now, back to finish my answer to your question. Sorry, I'm a little scattered. I don't know much about PETG other than what I've used it for, which is the one piece. And I didn't like the way it printed, so it went to another loving household. Hips, I know absolutely nothing about. Carbon fiber is just the way it sounds. It is the same as your carbon fiber tubes that some people use for weapon cords. It is very durable. It's high heat tolerance. The only thing is once it comes through the extruder nozzle and it's printed in a whatever piece you're going to print it, that piece is actually kind of brittle. And when it whereas like PLA, it'll flex and deform up to a certain point before it breaks. With carbon fiber, that window of alleviation, I guess is what the word I'm looking for, is very, very small. I would not wear a carbon fiber helmet on my head in a combat type situation. For our game, it's perfectly fine unless you fall or you run into a tree or something. It looks beautiful. Unfortunately, I don't have any to show you because all of those pieces are gone. But of all of them, I prefer to use PLA simply for the speed at which I can get everything set up and get it moving and going in the direction I needed to finish the project. So, great question. Anybody else?
Have you ever used a heat gun on PLA to, I mean, it's my theory, I haven't done it yet, um, to help with the sanding, to help with the layer line issue,
Um,
like melt it again?
okay, so I understand where that question comes from, but it doesn't actually work that way. So when 3D printing first became a thing, a lot of people were saying that you could use a heat gun and heat up the PLA or whatever the material was, and then it would kind of melt it. So when you sanded it, it would be the same. It's kind of the same as blacksmithing when you're moving metal. That's actually not true. So actually, I can show you. Where is the piece that I don't? I've got two of these. So this works. All right, so I'm not going to use a heat gun, but the principle is the same. I'm actually going to use a blowtorch because it's faster. And a blowtorch is also very handy when you do 3D printing because you're going to deal with something called stringing. And what stringing is when it moves from, say your print moves from, your print nozzle moves from this end to this end, but there's nothing in the middle. Stringing is what actually happens across that. So let me show you this actual, what's going to happen if you use a heat gun for smoothing and you're not incredibly careful. Let me flip my camera around. Okay, there we go. Excuse the mess. So this is actually one of the hands for the project that goes along with that one that is printing right now. So what you do, all right, that was what, 4 seconds? See that? I did it on the back side. That's the front. That's the back. That was not even, I gotta figure out how this camera thing works. That was not even more than a few seconds. And it was hot enough to actually melt the plastic to the point where I can, even now, I can still put my finger through and you can hear the cracking. That's the other downside of using a heat, like a heat gun or a blowtorch or another heat apparatus, is it makes the plastic very brittle. I don't recommend it. Some people have actually found a way to make it work, but they've put in hours, days, weeks of work experimenting and figuring out what the proper temperatures are, what the proper time frame is to expose it to the heat and things like that. I don't like working with those parameters, mainly because my main goal is to produce a piece that is show quality, that I can show off to people and have other people say, oh, that's awesome. And then, either ask me questions or I can educate them as I am today. See any other questions?
So do you usually like design the stuff yourself or you just pull it off on like Thingiverse or whatever?
Yeah, and what do you use to design it as well?
Okay. The actual answer to that is both. Yes, I do design some of my own pieces. I don't do design work very well. Basically, this is probably the extent of my design knowledge. This is a basic handle. It's a big tube with a chamfer to a smaller tube to a charcoal briquette shape, and then I glued them all together within the machine or within the program. There's several programs you can use. Windows 10 actually has one called 3D Print Builder or something like that. A lot of people use that one. It's actually pretty good. I personally prefer Blender. It's been around for I want to say about a decade, because if I remember correctly, when I was taking classes for digital graphics, that was one of the programs that we used, and that was about 10 years ago. There's also, and I just drew a blank. I literally had all this information in my head 5 seconds ago. 3D print builder, Blender.
I use Fusion 360.
Thank you. That's the one, Fusion 360. I did use Fusion 360 up until last year when they changed their pricing profile, and hobby artists kind of got screwed.
You can still do it. You can still get the free version.
Oh, you can?
Yeah, you totally can. That's what I use. I'm not good at it.
I will have to look into that again. Actually, the pink handle thing that I designed was actually designed on Fusion 360. It's a great program. There's about 5 or 6 more. There's programs to take your 2D drawings and make them 3D print or 3D objects. There's programs to scan objects and set vertices and vectors and things like that, so that you have a 3D print render that you can then plug into a machine and then print. There's also Mesh Mixer, which is great for editing 3D prints. I use it for, like, if I have a huge print, because my build volume on my printer is 12 inches wide, 12 inches tall, 12 inches deep. Actually, no, take that back. 12 inches wide, 12 inches deep, 14 inches tall, 300 by 400. That's big enough for me to print an entire helmet in one shot without having to put it together and glue and add to my finishing time. There are smaller printers and there are larger printers, but where was I going with this? Oh, Mesh Mixer. So the piece that's on my printer right now is one of 4 pieces that are maximum size, and I had to split it into 4 for a chest piece that I am building. Mesh Mixer is great because it's really easy to plot your cuts and separate the shells of your model, so you can take things out that you don't want and add things that you do. You can also do undercuts and things like that. So I prefer Blender when I'm getting started, like, especially because Blender is a more seamless interaction between say your metallics, say armor, and then if you want to go from, say, like a metal strip in the middle of the chest to bone as it gets further out, Blender is really good at switching between organics and metallics and flat surfaces and more fleshy type surfaces. Anything else? Any other questions?
Do you use Cura? Do you have a preferred slicer?
Actually, so from my slicer, I use Simplify 3D. I downloaded Cura at one point, and it worked well for me, but it was more than I needed for the way that I set up my prints and the machine that I use to print. So Simplify 3D is easier. I pull up my piece, I set my supports, I orient my piece so that it uses the minimum of supports, and then I save it to SD card, pop that in my printer, hit print, and then I wait and start lifting weight so I can, do all the sanding and build up my cardio. Anyone else? Anybody else have a question? Okay. I am, so since there's no other questions about the actual 3D printing like process or the tools used for that, I'm gonna go back to the finishing. And after sanding, once you get it to the surface finish that you want, then that's when you can move into things like leather wrapping or cloth covering or even plastic dipping or anything like that. Now, each one has its ups and downs. Leather wrapping is the easiest, obviously. Take a piece, wrap it in leather, make sure the leather looks good, done deal, out the door. Cloth is the same up to a point. With cloth, you have to be a little more careful because it is easy to lose detail, but it's also easy to add detail in the form of wrinkles or kinks or say one piece of your cloth cover flips over and then you've glued it in place and now you're kind of stuck. There's also a resin coating, which I addressed earlier, where you put the resin on and you sand the resin and you keep doing thin coats of that and waiting and sanding and waiting and applying and all that until you get the finish that you want. The only problem with resin coating is you always will have an extra coat of resin to do even after you're done. Because once you've got everything sanded, you still have to get the sanding marks out of your piece. Now, if you use a buffer wheel or anything like that, I don't, but if you do, then that'll remove most of the need for that extra top coat. But there's still going to be some scratches that you just cannot buff out, and you're going to need that top coat, which brings itself to a whole new host of problems. Because if you don't put the piece down right and your top coat settles weird, you got to sand it off and do it all over again. Plastic dipping is the same as with shields or swords or whatever pieces that you guys are used to seeing on the field. The only thing with plastic dip is you have to make sure that your piece is as smooth as you want it to be, because plastic dip will, just like paint, show you every flaw that you forgot to fix. There's also molding and casting, which is another class that I plan on teaching in a few months. That one is the easiest, but the hardest, and also the most labor intensive. However, if you do it right, 1 second, I need to pull this out. It's a little difficult to get it out of the silicone. Okay, this is taking much longer than I thought it would. There we go. All right. So, with molding and casting, if everything goes perfectly and you smooth the piece to get it ready for molding and casting, and you put your final paint job on, so it's got your perfect surface, and your silicone won't pick up any imperfections or any other little like brushes or any pieces of your brushes when you smooth everything out and put it all on. you'll end up with a piece that looks kind of like this. Now, this is actually a 3D printed Red Hood helmet. You can see the inside layer lines. It was printed in red silk PLA from Nico Industries, today's video sponsor. Again, sand it up to 4,000 to get it smooth. Most of this is black rattle can to get the base shiny coats on. You can see there where I went through and sanded through the paint in some spots. And then here's resin coated after dusting it with graphite dust and giving it a dust coat of a high gloss silver to get that. I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, to get that that effect. Then I coated it in resin and I sanded it smooth and made a mold of it so I can now make this helmet forever. Or for another, oh man, for another 50 to 60 pulls. Does anybody have any questions? We've got about 10 minutes left in the class.
So if you're trying to finish a build and like you've got it printed, you've got it sanded, everything like that, and you want to like wear it out to the field or use it in any way, what have you like kind of figured out what kind of finishing technique is like the strongest? Like take some wear and tear or anything like that?
Okay, so yes and no. I am still experimenting with a few different finishes, but in the years that I've been 3D printing so far, the strongest has always been resin coating. But I do my resin coating a little differently. Like that Red Hood helmet was the last time I did the basic resin coating process. So now what I do is, and I don't have any of those helmets because I am waiting for them to dry. So what I do now is I will take a piece and I will put a thin layer of resin all the way across, all over the piece, all the way over it. And then I will put a layer of very thin cloth, almost like muslin. I think that's the cloth I'm thinking of. It's super, super thin. Feels like if you sneeze on it wrong, you'll destroy it completely, but it's not lace. I'll take a thin layer of that and I'll cut it into strips and I'll put that on the helmet, let the resin set, and then go over it with 1 or 2 more coats of resin before I even start sanding, because I don't want to mess with the cloth and sand through the cloth. Reason why I do that is because if, like, say you fall down, which it's highly likely, especially if you've ever seen me fight, it happens a lot. If you fall down, it's more likely to crack than it is to shatter. Oh, these allergies are killing me. So if you take a 3D printed piece out and you sand it, you get it all smooth and everything, Bondo coated or whatever, resin and everything, and you take it out to the field and you fall on it, it's still plastic. And it's still going to react the way plastic does, which means it's going to crack, it's going to break, it's going to chip out. You're going to have, stop it! Leave the cat alone. Sorry. You're going to have, your paint's going to flake off, things like that. That's gonna happen with almost every processing or post-processing that you use. With the resin coating and with the resin and cloth, basically what you're doing is you're forming a shell around the plastic, and the cloth will actually help to hold the plastic in place. So even if it cracks, it doesn't damage your finished surface. So like the plastic inside may crack, but your surface will hold, at least hold enough that it'll take a minor amount of refinishing work to get it back to that smooth surface that you wanted originally. Now, if you want battle damage, then, run with it. But as far as I'm concerned, the resin and cloth process for me is the best one because it's more durable, and it also it removes the need for so many layers of resin or paint, unless you make a mistake and overlap a seam somewhere in the wrong spot. Because paint will, like I said, paint will show you every mistake that you have not corrected, which sometimes can be a lot. And that's a lot of the reason why most people don't get into 3D printing, because the post-processing actually normally takes longer than the original processing of the piece by the 3D printer. Now, since we've got 3 minutes left in the class, just real quick, I'm going to hit a few points just to go over them once again. In answer to the statement that the 3D printer does all of the work, that's not correct at all. The 3D printer does a lot of the original beginning work. It saves you time because while it's building this, like part A, you can be doing the finish work on part B, or the design work, or something like that. But the printer is also just as fast as you are. Some people are faster than 3D printers, much, much faster. I can build this same thing out of foam and it would take me a third of the time, but it's foam, and foam has its own problems. I actually do build faster than my 3D printer, but the fact that I can take this piece and I can get it all smoothed out, make a mold of it, and rebuild it 10, 20, 30 times without having to actually rebuild it 10 or 20 or 30 times is the appeal for 3D printing. So yes, the 3D printer does do a lot of the work in the beginning, but it does not do all of the work. The post-processing is always longer than the printing itself, unless you print something like a coin or like a very basic palm or handle or something like that, in which case then the printer might take longer to build it than it does for you to post-process it, or if you do something like leather wrapping or anything like that. Designing is always going to take probably 5 to 6 times longer than the actual printing is going to take. Like making the part in 3D wireframe mesh so your printer can read it and actually lay down the filament is going to take forever longer than actually printing the piece. Case in point, that piece, that the handle that I designed took about, I'd say about maybe 23 hours, because I could not figure out how to get the diamond print lattice work on it. It took about 6 hours to print. So it was almost 4 times as long designing it than it was to print it. And then if you add in finishing time, the printer itself would probably have done about 20 to 25% of the actual work for the piece if we are judging for, like, say, ANS or anything like that. However, 90% of or actually all of the work was done by me, because I set up the print, I designed the piece, I made sure that the parameters were plugged in properly, I made sure the print bed was leveled, I made sure that the filament didn't break, didn't snap, made sure that the layer lines didn't shift, the print head didn't overheat, maintenance on the 3D printer, things like that. 3D printing is a lot more than just tell the printer to do this and in 10 hours you have the piece that you're looking for. It's so much more than that. I'm actually thinking about turning this into like a monthly or a bi-weekly segment to be added to the Kingdom YouTube page. If I do that, then I will actually have scripted videos and things like that, because me rambling on is terrible idea. But it is 5:17 classes, 2 minutes run, 2 minutes longer than was planned. So I will not hold you guys here to listen to my annoying voice droning on and on and on anymore. Hope I've given you information to consider with respect to 3D printing and 3D print finishing. Feel free to send me any messages in my inbox, or ask me questions in person. If you see me, I am more than happy to explain any and all processes that I use in detail if you are interested. But with that being said, long live GP, all praise Skywatch, and I'm out.